They didn't know his name. That was the first thing. After 31 years of walking those halls, of watching that company grow from 12 employees in a rented office above a dry cleaner to a glass tower with 400 people inside it, they didn't know his name. He wore the gray uniform because he wanted to. That part matters. His name was Emmett Dorsey, 62 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that men get when they've spent their youth doing real work with their hands, and lean in the face in the way that happens when a man carries quiet grief for a long time without putting it down. He drove a 2009 Chevy pickup that he kept immaculately clean. He ate lunch alone, most days, at a corner table in the basement cafeteria, reading the Wall Street Journal on his phone with his glasses pushed down his nose. Nobody asked him what he was reading. Nobody sat down. The gray uniform was a test. It had always been a test. Emmett had started Dorsey Capital Management in 1993 with $40,000 he'd saved working double shifts as an electrician and a small business loan from a bank that almost didn't give it to him. He'd built it into one of the most respected mid-size investment firms in the mid-Atlantic. He'd survived 2 recessions, a divorce, the death of his son, and a hostile acquisition attempt from a competitor in 2018 that he'd defeated so cleanly and completely that the competitor's board had quietly resigned. He had done all of this, and still at 62, he was the kind of man who felt more comfortable in a gray uniform than a boardroom suit. He'd never loved the performance of success. He'd only ever loved the work. 3 years ago, after his daughter convinced him to step back from day-to-day operations for the sake of his blood pressure, Emmett had done something unusual. He'd handed operational control to a newly hired executive director, a woman named Candace Whitmore, 41, MBA from Wharton, sharp as a straight razor and exactly as cold. And he'd told his general counsel to process the transition quietly. No announcement to staff, no press release. He wanted to watch. He wanted to see what happened to a company when its people didn't know who was watching. So he'd come back as a building contractor, maintenance crew. He wore the gray uniform of the facilities team run by a subcontractor, carried a toolbox, and spent 3 days a week walking the floors of the building he owned, fixing things, listening to things, seeing things that nobody ever bothered to hide from a man in a gray uniform. What he saw troubled him deeply. The annual Winter Client Gala was held every December on the 42nd floor, in the glass-walled event space that Emmett had designed himself, the one with the unobstructed view of the city that made first-time visitors go quiet for a moment when they stepped off the elevator. It was a significant event. Clients flew in from Boston, from Charlotte, from Chicago. There were catered appetizers and an open bar and a jazz quartet in the corner, and a very deliberate atmosphere of relaxed confidence that said, "Your money is safe here, and the people who manage it are the kind of people you'd want at your dinner table." Emmett arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon, 2 hours before guests, with his toolbox and a work order for a flickering recessed light above the coat check. He'd written the work order himself. The event staff was already moving through the space. Caterers arranging chafing dishes, a florist adjusting centerpieces, 2 young men in black vests setting up the bar. Emmett nodded at them as he passed. They nodded back. That was the language of people doing work together before a party started. Brief, functional, no performance required. He'd fixed the light in 11 minutes. Then he'd found a stool near the service corridor and stayed. He stayed because he wanted to see her work. Candace Whitmore arrived at 5:15, which was 20 minutes later than Emmett believed an executive director should arrive before a major client event. But he said nothing about that to himself. He filed it. She came through the main elevator in a black evening gown that probably cost more than a junior analyst's monthly salary. Her hair pulled back tightly. Her posture, the posture of someone who had decided, at some point in her life, that she would take up exactly as much space as she wanted and let other people adjust around her. She walked the room with her assistant trailing behind her, taking notes on a tablet. She adjusted 2 centerpieces. She spoke briefly with the jazz quartet leader. She approved the bar setup. She was efficient. Emmett gave her that. Then she spotted him. He was moving a folding table toward the service corridor. One of the caterers had asked him to help shift it out of the way, and he was doing it slowly because his left knee had been bothering him since October, and Candace Whitmore watched him for about 4 seconds before she walked across the room with the specific energy of a person who has found something wrong and intends to correct it loudly. "Excuse me," she said. Not to him exactly, more toward him, the way you might address furniture that had been placed incorrectly. "What are you doing?" Emmett set down his end of the table. "Moving this for your catering team," he said. "They needed the clearance for the—" "Who authorized you to be up here?" she said. "This is a private event floor. Maintenance doesn't work up here on gala nights. That's a standing policy." "I had a work order for a light fixture," Emmett said. "Flickering recessed light above coat check. It's done. I was just helping out before I headed down." Candace looked at him the way certain people look at certain other people. The look that is not quite contempt, but is contempt's first cousin, the one that lives just behind the eyes and never quite makes it fully to the face because the person has enough social awareness to keep it leashed, mostly. She looked at his uniform, at his toolbox, at his hands. "You're done now," she said. "Please use the service elevator." "Of course," Emmett said. He picked up his toolbox. He was not embarrassed. He had been spoken to this way before, in many contexts, across 6 decades of American life, and he had learned long ago that embarrassment required a certain belief in the other person's authority over your sense of self, and he had simply stopped granting that. He walked toward the service corridor. Behind him, he heard Candace say something to her assistant in a lowered voice, and her assistant made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an acknowledgement. And Emmett kept walking. He took the service elevator down to the 2nd floor, sat in the break room for a while with a cup of coffee, and thought carefully about what he was going to do. The gala was in full swing by 7:30. Emmett knew this because he could hear it from the lobby, where he'd taken a seat on the bench near the security desk, his toolbox at his feet, his jacket off, looking for all the world like a man waiting for someone to come down. The security guard, a young man named Terrence, who was not on the 10 Ningoi list, and who went home every night to a wife and a 4-month-old daughter, and who had once spent 20 minutes helping Emmett troubleshoot a stuck freight elevator door on a Tuesday. Terrence nodded at him and went back to his monitor. At 7:45, Emmett's phone buzzed. It was a text from his general counsel, a woman named Patricia Geist, who had been with him for 19 years, and who was upstairs right now, circulating among clients with a glass of sparkling water because she'd been sober for 11 years. The text said, "She's doing it again." Emmett typed back, "Tell me." Patricia's response came in pieces, the way she always texted when she was being careful about who might see her screen. "Dennis from the Hargrove account came in tonight with his son. His son works physical trades, came straight from a job site, jeans and work boots. She told the door team not to let him up, said he wasn't dressed appropriately. Dennis had to come down to the lobby to get him." Emmett read that twice. Dennis Hargrove, he thought, whose family had been clients since 2004, whose account represented the 3rd largest individual portfolio in the firm's current book of business, whose son, a 34-year-old electrician who had, as far as Emmett knew, done nothing wrong in his life, except show up to a party in the wrong clothes after a long workday, had been turned away at the door of a building that Emmett owned. He put his phone in his pocket. He picked up his toolbox. He rode the service elevator to 42. He came out through the kitchen, as he always did, and he stood for a moment in the doorway between the kitchen and the main event space, and he looked at the room. The jazz quartet was playing something low and unhurried. The city glittered through the glass walls. The guests, 60, maybe 65 of them, moved in the comfortable, slow patterns of people who had eaten well and were on their 2nd drink and felt, for the moment, looked after. Candace Whitmore was near the center of the room, speaking with two men Emmett recognized as partners from a feeder fund out of Baltimore. She was animated. She was good at this part, the performance of it, and Emmett had never denied that. She could work a room. She could make people feel important. It was the other parts she'd failed at, the quiet parts. The parts that happened when nobody was performing. Emmett walked across the room. He didn't hurry. He moved the way he'd always moved, steadily, without apology, with the unhurried gait of a man who has long since stopped needing to signal anything to anyone. He was still in the gray uniform. He was still carrying the toolbox, and the room did what rooms always do when something slightly wrong enters them. It adjusted. Guest moved fractionally aside without quite knowing why. Eyes glanced and looked away. The two men speaking with Candace noticed him first. He saw them notice, and then Candace turned. Her face moved through three expressions very quickly: recognition, annoyance, a controlled settling into something harder. "Sir," she said, stepping toward him with the clear intention of intercepting him before he reached the guests. "I told you. I know what you told me," Emmett said. His voice was calm. It was the calm of a man who's decided something and is no longer in the process of deciding it. "This is a private, Patricia," Emmett said, raising his voice just enough to carry across the room. Patricia Geislich looked up from across the space. She'd been watching. She'd been watching since he walked in, and she crossed to him now with the efficient stride of someone who has been waiting for a cue. "Mr. Dorsey," she said, and her voice carried. The room shifted. That happened, the shift when a title was applied unexpectedly, when the geometry of a situation rearranged itself. Emmett watched it happen across the faces nearest to him. The recalibration, the second glance at his uniform, the quiet arithmetic of weight. Candace Whitmore's face did not go pale exactly. It went still, the way a pond goes still right before something surfaces. "I'm sorry," she said. "Patricia," Emmett said, setting his toolbox down on a nearby highboy table, with a sound that was not loud but was definitive. "I need the board resolution file, the original articles of incorporation, and I need someone to please go down to the lobby and bring Dennis Hargrove and his son back upstairs. Offer them whatever they'd like." Patricia was already on her phone. Candace was looking at him. "I don't understand," she said. "Who are you?" And Emmett Dorsey, founder and sole majority shareholder of Dorsey Capital Management, the man who had built this company from $40,000 and 2 hands and 31 years of uncommon patience, looked at the woman who had turned away a client's son for wearing work boots, who had spoken to him like a fixture to be moved, who had spent 3 years running a company she did not own and had apparently forgotten, or perhaps had never understood, the difference between authority and ownership. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm the building," he said. He said it quietly, which was the most devastating way to say it. The room had gone very still by this point, the kind of still that a room of 60 people can achieve when every one of them has simultaneously decided to stop performing and start paying attention. The jazz quartet had reached the natural end of a song and hadn't started the next one. Someone near the bar set down a glass. That was the only sound. Candace Whitmore was not a woman who frightened easily. Emmett could see that, even now. She had the kind of spine that comes from a certain kind of ambition, the spine that holds even when the ground shifts. But the ground had shifted in a way she hadn't planned for, and the spine was doing what it could. "I need to see identification," she said, which was the wrong thing to say but was probably the only thing she had. "You've seen my face 3 times this week," Emmett said. "On Tuesday, when I replaced the HVAC filter on the 38th floor. On Wednesday, when I was in the parking structure, checking the emergency lighting. And tonight, when you told me to use the service elevator." Patricia appeared at his elbow with a leather portfolio. Inside it were the original articles of incorporation for Dorsey Capital Management, dated March 1993, bearing Emmett's signature in blue ink on the founding documents, along with the most recent board resolution confirming his status as 78% majority shareholder and ultimate executive authority of the firm. She handed it to him without a word. He didn't open it. He set it on the highboy table next to the toolbox. "You can look at that whenever you'd like," he said to Candace. "It's not going anywhere." One of the Baltimore partners, older man, silver-haired, who had been a client of the firm's for 11 years and who had dealt exclusively with Emmett in the early years before Emmett stepped back, took 3 steps forward and looked at Emmett with a slow, careful look. "Emmett Dorsey," the man said. It was not a question. "Thomas," Emmett said, and shook his hand. That was the moment. The room understood. You could see it move through the space the way temperature moves, not visible exactly, but felt on the skin. Candace Whitmore said, "I didn't know. I know you didn't," Emmett said. He was not unkind about it. He was something more final than unkind. He was simply accurate. That's been the problem. He picked up the leather portfolio. He held it for a moment. "3 years ago, I stepped back because my doctor told me my blood pressure was going to put me in the ground before I was 65 if I didn't slow down. So I slowed down. But I never stopped paying attention." He looked around the room, at the clients, at the staff, at the caterers, who had stilled near the kitchen doorway and were watching like everyone else. "I've been in this building every week for 3 years, watching, listening, learning what happens to the people inside these walls when they think the owner isn't watching." He let that sit for a moment. "Some of what I saw was excellent. There are people in this firm who do remarkable work with integrity and care, and I intend to make sure they know I've noticed." He paused. "And some of what I saw was not excellent." Candace Whitmore was very still now. Still in the way that people get when they understand, at a cellular level, that the next few minutes are going to determine the shape of what comes after. "Candace," Emmett said, and he used her first name for the first time, because formality at this point would have been a kind of cruelty he wasn't interested in. "There's a client in the lobby right now. His name is Dennis Hargrove, and his son came here tonight straight from a job site to support his father. He was turned away from this event because of his clothes." Candace opened her mouth. "I know why," Emmett said. "I've seen the policy you implemented. Dress code enforcement for gala events. I understand the intention. I don't dispute that there are times when—" He stopped. He took a breath. He was choosing his words not for her benefit, but for the room's benefit, for the record of this moment. The intention and the application are 2 different things. Turning away the son of one of our oldest clients because he works with his hands and came in work boots is not a dress code decision. It's a values decision, and it tells me something about the values operating in this firm when I'm not in the room. The room was very quiet. Dennis Hargrove and his son arrived on the 42nd floor at 8:17, escorted up by building security and Patricia Geist. Dennis was a stocky man in his 60s, with a strong handshake and an easy manner, and his son, whose name was Alonzo, and who was wearing jeans and work boots and a flannel shirt, and who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth right now, followed behind his father with the careful dignity of someone who'd been taught not to show the wound. Emmett crossed the room to meet them at the elevator. He shook Dennis's hand first. Then he turned to Alonzo and shook his hand, held it for a moment longer than the handshake required. "I'm glad you came," Emmett said. "I'm sorry for what happened at the door. That was wrong, and I take responsibility for it." Alonzo Hargrove looked at him, at the gray uniform, at the toolbox still sitting on the highboy table across the room, at the leather portfolio, at the room of 60 people who were watching this exchange with the focused attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that will be told as a story later. "You own this place?" Alonzo said. "I do," Emmett said. Alonzo was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were wearing that uniform when we came in. I was, on purpose?" "On purpose." Alonzo looked at him for a long moment. Then something in his face settled, some braced and careful thing that had been holding since the lobby, and he said quietly so that only the three of them could hear it. My dad has talked about this firm for 20 years. I'm glad it's run by someone who knows what it's like. Emmett nodded. He didn't say anything else. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be received. Candace Whitmore left the event at 8:45. She did not make a scene. She was not the kind of woman who made scenes, and Emmett had never expected her to. She gathered her things from the coat check, her wrap, her clutch, and she walked to the service elevator, which Emmett noticed, and which he thought was perhaps unconscious on her part, or perhaps the opposite of unconscious. She did not look at him as she passed. His general counsel called him the next morning at 7:15. He was on his second cup of coffee and had the Wall Street Journal open on his phone. "How do you want to handle it?" she asked. "Separation agreement," Emmett said. "Fair severance. No cause listed. She's talented. She'll land somewhere. But the firm's going in a different direction. She'll likely dispute. Let her read the employment contract," Emmett said. Section 12. I retained operational veto on all major personnel and strategic decisions. She had authority within defined parameters. The events of last night fall outside those parameters in 3 distinct ways that I'll be happy to outline for her attorney if it comes to that. It didn't come to that. The separation agreement was signed 6 days later. Emmett did not gloat about it. He did not tell the story at happy hours or use it as an anecdote in interviews. He had never been that kind of man. He did send Dennis Hargrove a handwritten note. 3 sentences. He apologized again. He thanked Dennis for 20 years of trust. He said he hoped Alonzo knew that the people who built things with their hands were the people who kept the world upright. Dennis called him when he got the note. They talked for 40 minutes. It was the best conversation Emmett had had in months. In the weeks that followed, several things happened at Dorsey Capital Management that had not happened in the 3 years prior. Emmett came back. Not in the gray uniform, though he kept it folded neatly in the bottom drawer of his desk, as a reminder, but in the role that had always been his. He walked the floors. He learned names. He ate lunch in the basement cafeteria, same corner table, same glasses pushed down his nose, but now people sat down. A junior analyst named Therese, not on any list, sharp-eyed and careful, once asked him what he was reading, and he spent 20 minutes explaining the article to her and then asking her what she thought, and she had opinions that were more sophisticated than those of 2 senior associates he'd met that same week. And he made a note. He reinstated an open-door policy for any staff member to request a meeting with senior leadership, which had been quietly discontinued under Candace Whitmore because she had found it inefficient. He established a mentorship fund in his son's name for first-generation professionals entering the finance industry. He promoted Patricia Geist to Chief Operating Officer, which she'd earned 13 years ago, and he was only sorry he hadn't done it sooner. And every Wednesday, he put on the gray uniform and walked the building. Not because he had to, not because it served any operational purpose, but because Emmett Dorsey had learned something over 62 years that he believed was worth preserving, that the most important information in any organization lives closest to the floor. The people who clean the hallways know more about what's really happening than the people in the corner offices. They always have. They always will. He carried the toolbox because sometimes there were things that needed fixing, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The flickering light above the coat check, incidentally, he had fixed properly. It had not flickered since. "I want to ask you something before we're done here. I've been watching this story the same way Emmett watched that building, from a distance that lets you see things clearly. And what I've noticed is this. The moment that changes everything in this story isn't the reveal. It isn't when Patricia says Mr. Dorsey and the room goes quiet. It isn't the portfolio on the highboy table or Candace Whitmore taking the service elevator down. The moment that changes everything is earlier, much earlier. It's when Emmett Dorsey picks up his toolbox and walks toward the service corridor, and he is not embarrassed. That's the moment. Because that moment, that quiet, undefeated, unhurried moment, is what the rest of the story is built on. A man who cannot be diminished by someone else's contempt. A man who knows exactly who he is, regardless of what he's wearing. A man who has decided somewhere along the way that his worth is not up for negotiation. Most of us will never own a 42-story building. Most of us will never have the leverage that Emmett had, or the opportunity for a reversal as clean and complete as the one that happened that December night. But I think about that moment in the corridor. The toolbox, the unhurried walk. And I want to ask you, have you ever had to walk away from someone's contempt with your dignity completely intact? Have you ever stood in a gray uniform, metaphorically or literally, and refused to let someone else's smallness determine how you felt about yourself? Tell me, because that story, your story, is the one I want to hear.